we have an internal platform that we teach on that's offline that I said, look, let's just start teaching this stuff again because people need this information.
The HubZone program, for those that aren't familiar, is a program. It's another socioeconomic program that's run by SBA, but that program is almost like a community development program. Please don't use an old joint venture agreement. Please don't use a template that you find online or even that the SBA might give you, because those old agreements or those template agreements might not reflect where the regulations are currently, or the interpretation of the regulations is currently. I always tell folks, when it comes to joint venture agreements, make sure that you have a joint venture agreement, a compliant joint venture agreement in place at the time you submit your bid, because we still do see a lot of these requirements being either changed through regulations or clarified through case law. And if a joint venture agreement is non-compliant, doesn't meet SBA's requirements, then the joint venture might not be eligible. Absolutely. And that's something, when we work on joint venture agreements on behalf of our clients, we are coming at it from the mindset of, what does the regulation require? And beyond the regulation, what is OHA going to require if this ever gets to them? I've probably done hundreds of joint venture agreements over my career so far. So for a joint venture, the lay of the land as it exists right now, joint venture agreements do not have to be pre-approved by the SBA, except there's one exception, and that's if you're an 8A company looking for a sole source contract. In the context of an 8A sole source, then SBA is going to have to pre-approve your joint venture agreement before that contract can be awarded.
Well, quick, before we continue on, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? But go ahead and introduce yourself and your company. That way we take care of the formalities first while we continue this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm Matt Schoonover. I am the managing member of Schoonover and Moriarty. We are a Kansas-based, just outside of Kansas City, Kansas-based law firm that works exclusively with government contractors. So we counsel our clients on issues relating to regulatory compliance, FAR compliance, or complying with SBA's regulations. We help them with teaming agreements and subcontracts, joint venture agreements, mentor-protégé agreements, bid protests, size protests, claims, disputes, really just about anything that might come up when they work with the federal government.
Thank you for that. All right, I just want to make sure we get that way. And by the way, your other half is also Matthew as well.
That's right. We try and make it easy on folks. They can call the office and ask to talk to Matt and really get anybody.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So, well, from my record, I say Matthew and Matt is what makes it. So,
gotcha.
I call you Matt.
Yeah, people ask what to call me, and I say, you can call me really whatever you like, because I've usually been called worse. So,
right.
That's
fair. I like that. Hey, that's fair. All right. So bring us back up to speed. So now I saw on your website about the DBE program. Now I didn't know about the DBE program being challenged. That's new to me.
That program, and forgive me, I'm not as up to speed with that challenge as I otherwise might be, but I know that the Department of Transportation, that program is being challenged. I believe in Kentucky is where that challenge is currently pending. The DBE program, of course, is a very similar program to the 8A program in that, there are eligibility, I'm going to say benefits, but eligibility perks for individuals who have been, discriminated against in the past. Usually, our friends of more diverse backgrounds are those folks that generally qualify for the DBE program. And so that program, similarly, there's been a constitutional challenge, as I understand it, to that program as well. I think the briefing is still underway, last I checked, in that, but candidly, as we're kind of seeing where the judicial landscape is in some of these challenges, it wouldn't surprise me if the DBE program ultimately faces kind of some of the same headwinds that the 8A program has had.
So what are your thoughts on, you were heading in the direction of saying you're going to find that this is happening more often. That's kind of where you were headed prior to discussing DBE.
Well, absolutely. And I think, this comes back to, just a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court had a decision relating to affirmative action at Harvard University and really came down against continuation of affirmative action related programs. And as a result of that case, or I think following that case, we're starting to see more and more challenges to these type of programs that the government administers. Not only the government, quite frankly, but we're also seeing challenges to programs that some private entities offer as well. And I think that that's really kind of where things are right now. I don't know, I can't say whether the 8A program would ever be found to be unconstitutional as a whole, and that's not where we are right now. So the 8A program, Essentially, it still exists. However, every person that is applying for 8A ownership now must show by a preponderance of the evidence that they have been victimized by social and economic discrimination. Gone is or I should say enjoined, is the rebuttable presumption of social disadvantage that once existed under the program. And so that's kind of where we are now. I think SBA has done a really good job of navigating some of these difficult headwinds and still making the 8A program very viable and very powerful for those that are part of it.
Nice, nice. Yeah, I know that was a blow last year to everyone, but we survived and we got through it, and people did what they had to do to comply.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, credit to SBA at that point as well, because, they did a really good job of publicizing, here's the type of information that they want to see in a social disadvantage narrative. Now, there are some folks, some individuals who haven't been able to meet that requirement, individuals who were once able to utilize the rebuttable presumption that now are not able to show by a preponderance of the evidence there's social disadvantage. But SBA is in the process of wading through those issues and working with those companies.
Interesting. All right, what else is happening out here?
I think there's a lot. It's kind of never a dull day. Well,
No.
I guess I shouldn't say never a dull day, because some of the days can be pretty dull.
Right.
There's always something going on in the small business government contracting world. We've seen over the last year or two some kind of interesting developments in the HubZone program as well. The HubZone program, for those that aren't familiar, is a program. It's another socioeconomic program that's run by SBA. But that program is almost like a community development program, where if a small business has its principal office in a HubZone, a historically underutilized business zone, and at least 35% of that small business's employees live in a HubZone, that business can be eligible to participate in the HubZone program and gain HubZone set-aside contracts through that program. We have seen some issues over the last, year or two, where maybe some companies were relying on individuals, employees, the allegations are, to meet the 35% residency requirement by employing individuals who didn't do actual work on behalf of the company. And so SBA is in the process. They've released a policy statement explaining that, HubZone employees need to be doing legitimate work on behalf of the company, and that they'll look at job descriptions and work products and try and determine the supervisory level and all of that for these individuals when they're making that assessment. And we should see some regulatory guidance coming out in 2024 that puts that policy affirmatively into regulations as well.
Nice. Okay. All right. No, I mean, again, we can nerd out over this stuff.
Yeah.
But I think, going back to what people want to know about, I still think they love to hear about mentor-proteges and teaming and joint ventures. So
joint ventures, this is one that the regulations, I'm going to say the regulations are constantly in flux. And that's either because the regulations have been updated by the SBA or because they've been interpreted through Office of Hearings and Appeals case law. And so I always tell folks, when it comes to joint venture agreements, make sure that you have a joint venture agreement, a compliant joint venture agreement in place at the time you submit your bid, either that bid for a contract or for a task order. You want to make sure that those joint venture agreements are compliant and up to date, because we still do see a lot of these requirements being either changed through regulations or clarified through case law. And if a joint venture agreement is non-compliant, doesn't meet SBA's requirements at the time you submit your bid, then the joint venture might not be eligible. So that continues to be the biggest issue that we see with joint ventures, is, quite frankly, folks not updating their joint venture agreements to include a lot of the contract specific information that SBA's regulations require.
So, meaning people like myself who use our old joint venture agreements?
Please don't do that. Please don't use an old joint venture agreement. Please don't use a template that you find online or even that the SBA might give you, because those old agreements or those template agreements might not reflect where the regulations are currently, or the interpretation of the regulations is currently. That's something that we really need to make sure is compliant. And really, if somebody is staying abreast of the case law and the regulatory changes, it's not something I think that takes a tremendous amount of time to do. Really, a lot of times when we review things as attorneys, we're generally spot checking and putting things in or making a few tweaks here and there just to make sure that they reflect the current regulatory environment. Because what you don't want to have happen is, to put all that time and money into submitting a bid on behalf of a joint venture, only to find out after the fact that, a joint venture agreement wasn't compliant, so you might not be eligible. That is certainly a heartbreaking situation when it happens.
Is it more of the SBA finding out, or is it more of like someone protesting and then it becomes discovered?
Yeah, usually what happens is, in my anecdotal experience, I'll say, is
Sure.
usually what happens is a competitor generally files a size or a status protest alleging that the joint venture isn't eligible for the award for some reason. Usually that reason relates to non-compliance of the joint venture agreement. And through that protest and appeal process, the protesters' attorneys may be able to get a copy of that joint venture agreement through a protective order. And then once they do, that's when they're able to really comb through it to see whether it meets those regulatory requirements. And again, that's something that's constantly kind of being updated and changed through the case law process. Our firm was involved in several protests last year on both sides, both as a protester and as an awardee defending its award, that related to the sufficiency of joint venture agreements.
Well, does that situation, I would imagine going through being on both sides, right? That helps you to become more knowledgeable how to prepare a defense for both sides, right?
Absolutely.
You can argue, like they said, you should be able to argue whether you agree or something or disagree, you should be able to argue both sides of it.
Yeah,
So,
and absolutely. And that's something, when we work on joint venture agreements on behalf of our clients, we are coming at it from the mindset of, what does the regulation require? And beyond the regulation, what is OHA going to require if this ever gets to them? So whenever I work on a joint venture agreement, and I've probably done hundreds of joint venture agreements over my career so far. Whenever I do them, I still have on one screen SBA's regulations pulled up, and on the other screen, I'm working on the joint venture agreement just because I need to make sure that I'm cross-referencing those requirements. And as new decisions come out that interpret those requirements, we're making note of those to say, okay, as we're working on joint venture agreements in the future, here's something that we need to keep in mind for these type of agreements or arrangements. The same is true, by the way, to a different extent, but it's also true when it comes to teaming agreements and subcontracts, where when we work on a teaming agreement and a subcontract, although it's not a joint venture agreement, when we go through it, part of what we're analyzing is, what is the risk of ostensible subcontractor affiliation here when it comes to this teaming agreement and this subcontract? Because if somebody challenges prime sub team on the basis of size, that's one of the arguments that's going to come up. And so when we go through those agreements, or when we work on those agreements, we always have an eye towards down the road to say, if we have to defend this agreement, if somebody challenges the size or status eligibility relating to this agreement, what's going to be our best defense, and are we building enough in to this agreement to pass muster?
So, I guess fortunately and unfortunately, you use a term that a lot of people don't know, ostensible subcontractor. And so I would ask you to clarify that, please.
Yep, absolutely. Ostensible subcontractor it's a type of affiliation that SBA might find. And for the uninitiated, affiliation under SBA's regulations is essentially a size penalty. If a small business has an affiliate, then when the SBA goes to determine that business's size, it's going to consider not only that small business's size, but it's going to add to it the size of its affiliates. And that combined size, the size of the small business together with any of its affiliates, has to fall below the operative size standard in order for that business to be considered a small business. So affiliation, as I mentioned, is essentially a size penalty. And it comes up under SBA's regulations if one business or one person has the power to control another. And one of those ways, SBA's regulations has some ways that it'll find, or it may find, affiliation between two companies. But a really unique way that exists specifically in the concept of prime sub teams is the concept of ostensible subcontractor affiliation. Ostensible subcontractor affiliation comes up in either of two instances, where either the prime contractor is relying on the subcontractor to perform the contract's primary and vital requirements, or if the prime contractor is otherwise unusually reliant on the subcontractor. And it's a really fact-specific inquiry. Especially in the unusual reliance cases, SBA considers 4 factors really in determining that. But ostensible subcontractor affiliation is very fact specific. And so that's why when I was mentioning that when we work on teaming agreements and subcontracts, we're going to work on those in a way to make sure that we're limiting the risk of finding ostensible subcontractor affiliation.
And really, if you're working 2 small businesses, none of this matters.
Well, in some cases, you're right. Now, if both of those small businesses, even if you were going to add their sizes together and they both fall below the size standard when their sizes are added together, then you're right. Affiliation,
it doesn't mean anything.
Even if you have it, there's no real consequence. And there's plenty of OHA cases out there, or SBA cases out there, where they say, we're not even really going to consider whether there's affiliation, because even if there is, the combined size is still under the size standard. And so there's really no harm there. It can be an issue depending on the size standard. Certainly if you've got businesses where their combined size might start to flirt with that size standard, or certainly exceeds that size standard. And we have seen cases where, even if there are 2 individually small businesses, by the time you aggregate them together, they do exceed that size standard. So in that case, affiliation is a significant consequence for those businesses. No,
and I like to. So one thing that I try to do is the opposite of the news. I don't want to scare people for things that don't apply to them. So I don't want to just scare the bejesus out of people. And it's like, oh, that doesn't matter. Oh, we're both $100,000 businesses. So, because people start worrying about these things too early on. And, it's interesting because my experience has taught me that people who are trying to work with some of these like billion-dollar companies, they're not the ones even thinking about this stuff. And they're the ones most at risk of this happening to them is what
I give a lot of presentations on small business and affiliation related topics. And usually when I do, one of the things that I like to say is, the point of the presentation isn't to make those in attendance experts on affiliation. You just can't really do that. Rather, it's to give those business owners or those kind of key personnel pause and say, when they look at their relationships with another business or another person or their subcontractor, depending on what the case may be, to see if the hair on the back of their neck stands up just a little bit, to say, this is something that I heard that guy talk about, and it could be an issue. So it's something that I need to be aware of. And maybe I'll give somebody a call and say, is this a risk? And if it is a risk, what are the consequences? And if the consequences are severe enough, then I need to make the strategic decision of saying, I'm either going to fracture this affiliation or I'm going to plow full steam ahead. It's all part of that assessment that I think a business owner has to make. And it all goes back to, like I said, just the hair on the back of the neck standing up to say, I think I heard something about this and it's something I need to follow up on. I think too many times people don't trust that instinct. They're worried about other things when it comes to putting their bids together, submitting under opportunities. And I think sometimes people would do well to take that pause and say, I need to run this to ground.
That brings up an interesting point. On our last conversation, we discussed that about bundling contracts. We know right now that the number of small businesses has decreased, right? Mm-hmm. Number of contracts, small businesses has increased. And so I personally sat in like a mid-table discussion with Mavie, and they talked about doing joint ventures and Mentor-Protégé. Like that's the SBA's answer to all this.
Right.
So what do you say? How do the small guys, like what do they do? Like how do they do it the right way?
Well, and unfortunately where we are right, and I say unfortunately because I think we are in kind of this era where under how the regulations have been set up, certainly for a lot of these larger procurements,
Right.
or these large IDIQ or GWAC contracts, really to be competitive, you almost have to have a mentor-protege joint
Correct.
venture with
Right.
I'm going to say larger, but more established company. I think that aspect or that reality is kind of an unintended consequence, quite frankly, of the regulations, where it's now turned small business awards, or awards that would be set aside for small businesses, true small businesses, to awards that sometimes large businesses can get a foot in that they otherwise didn't have a foot. So I
Mm.
think we'll start to see from SBA, kind of the pendulum will go back the other way, and we'll see maybe how those regulations might moderate. It's going to have to be through additional rulemaking, but interestingly enough, I'm on the ABA's Public Contracting Law Small Business Committee, and we had a meeting recently where John Klein from SBA was saying that SBA might have to consider essentially reining that stuff in, reining mentor protege joint ventures in, particularly under IDIQ and GWAC contracts, where almost that recognition of, is this really the environment that we want? Where in order for a small business to be competitive, it's got to have this relationship with a large business. That I think is on the horizon. But the reality of it is now, on February 19th, 2024, when you and I are talking, absolutely, it remains one of these issues that I think for small businesses, if they're not considering a mentor protege joint venture, I think they might be behind the eight ball on some of these procurements.
Yeah. No, and that's what I'm saying because as I, like yourself, as I speak around the country and I travel around the country, I see so many of these small businesses struggling,
Yeah.
and the requirements seem to be getting larger and larger and larger. I mean, I've seen construction contracts that require a $10 million single limit bond for a small business. Right. I mean, $10 million bond for small, that's not small business,
Right. Right.
So, I mean, and then when I read your ostensible subcontracting rule, right? We talk about the four factors, right? It's like
Mhm.
the proposed subcontractor is the incumbent contractor ineligible to compete. They're using some of their same proposed management staff. Well,
Right.
I mean, how else am I gonna get to that next threshold,
Yeah. And I
right?
think, for a lot of those factors, it's all a question of degree.
Yeah. Well, lack relevant
And
experience.
yeah.
Bonding is something that you cannot get to the next level without having the experience, and you can't get the
Yep.
experience without getting it. So it's the chicken and the egg situation.
Well, and bonding is a really unique issue when it comes to affiliation too, because there is case law out there that suggests, relying on another party for bonding, guarantees or whatever the case may be, is really indicative of affiliation. And so certainly we have been seeing that in mentor protege agreements between two companies, if bonding is a necessity, that bonding guarantees or assistance in obtaining bonding is an item of assistance that the mentor may help the protege obtain under that mentor protege agreement. And so certainly, that does tend to be an issue that we see specifically, obviously, in the contracting realm, is to say, how are we going to satisfy these bonding requirements?
So now again, all right. So like you said, we're behind the eight ball. So when do we team and when do we look to joint venture slash MPP?
That's the $1 million question.
Right?
And I'm going to give the lawyer's answer and say it depends.
I like.
Um, this is, by the way, this is my dog's chair. I don't just have like a random chair here.
Okay.
She's in the office. You might see her hop up there later.
Okay.
Sorry that we can edit that out. The question of whether should I form a prime sub team, should I joint venture? That's that is very dependent ultimately on the underlying solicitation and the party's abilities to meet those requirements. There are going to be factors that come into play, like the limitation on subcontracting, that's going to be applicable to the contract requirement. And then on top of that, for the joint venture, we also have the performance of work requirement. And so understanding how those two things go hand in hand under the particular opportunity, and really the realistic assessment of how much work can that small business do, relating to that contract. What's its capacity? What's its ability to handle that work? That's all stuff that's going to factor into that decision. A lot of times, I think folks will be able to get away with a prime sub team, that they wouldn't necessarily have to joint venture. We're seeing folks enter into joint venture agreements more and more, I think, as a replacement for prime sub teams. But prime subcontractor teams still have a very established place, and they tend to be, if it works under the solicitation, a really great solution that's pretty flexible in a lot of ways. And so it's really a holistic look at what the solicitation requires and what the parties' capabilities are to determine which way they should go.
What are some of the things where, I'll ask a question a different way, where you've seen teaming not work?
The teaming sometimes the teaming doesn't work. We mentioned bonding earlier. If there's
Right.
if there's certain bonding requirements, then sometimes we find that joint ventures, particularly through a mentor-protégé joint venture, if one party's really relying on another for that bond, might be the best way to go. If there are certain clearance requirements that maybe one venturer has, but the other one doesn't, that might be something to consider at that point as well. If there are concerns, let's take a services contract. So it could be construction, it could be, whatever, but just a general services contract. Generally, a services contract has a 50% limitation on subcontracting, meaning the prime contractor has to perform at least 50% of that work. There's some exceptions to that, but that's kind of the general rule. Well, in the context of a joint venture, limitation on subcontracting is still going to apply, but in this case, the prime contractor is actually the joint venture entity. So that joint venture entity would have to perform at least 50% of that work. And then the performance of work requirement, which is applicable only to joint ventures, says that, okay, of the work that the joint venture performs, the managing venture or the protege venture has to perform 40% at least of that work. And so depending on what the work share looks like, we could have a situation where maybe a small business is saying, I can't really prime this. I don't have the ability to prime this because I can't do 50% of that work myself. But maybe what they can do is form a joint venture, and that will reduce the amount of work that they ultimately have to do under those requirements. So we do see some instances where, because a contract, you mentioned earlier that we're seeing fewer and fewer contracts, but of greater and greater value. As that continues, we're seeing some businesses really take a look and say, can I do all of this work myself? Or what is required of me myself? And if that answer is no, then maybe a joint venture would be a way to think about kind of, working under those performance requirements.
There was something I heard last year towards the end of the year that they changed the approval process for joint ventures for people with socioeconomic designations.
That's correct. So for a joint venture, the new rule, as the lay of the land as it exists right now, joint venture agreements do not have to be pre-approved by the SBA, except there's one exception, and that's if you're an 8A company looking for a sole source contract. In the context of an 8A sole source, then SBA is going to have to pre-approve your joint venture agreement before that contract can be awarded. For every other opportunity, including competitive 8A opportunities, SBA will no longer pre-approve joint venture agreements. Instead, really what's going to happen is the sufficiency of that joint venture agreement may be tested on the back end. So again, if your size or status is protested, that's when somebody will really be looking at that joint venture agreement to make sure that it complies.
Do you like that rule?
Yes, I do. And the reason why I do is because before it was, it was sometimes a cumbersome process to get the local 8A offices to actually approve those joint venture agreements as was required, or as were required under the regulations. And even then, sometimes what they were doing to give approval is they were requiring things, and I say they, it wasn't every area office was requiring this. It was some of the offices were, but they were requiring things that were outside of the regulations that really made compliance difficult and frankly needlessly expensive, because if you've got somebody who has a compliant joint venture agreement, meets all the regulatory requirements, coming in and adding more requirements that are outside of the regulations on top of that, and then withholding that acceptance, I think is just too onerous for a lot of small businesses, too needless for a lot of small businesses. So yeah, I do like the.
That's joint venture. What about the mentor-protege part?
Yeah, so with the Mentor-Protégé program, I think it's still a great program for small businesses that are looking to develop their capabilities, that are looking to grow or become more successful government contractors. And really, under that program, what's going to happen is an established business, could be a large or a small, but an established business, the mentor is going to provide business development assistance to the protege. And really, that business development assistance is whatever the protege thinks that it needs to grow, and whatever it is able to agree on with the mentor, that's going to be provided under that agreement. And there's some really good benefits to the mentor-protege agreement, but one of them in particular is if an item of assistance is identified under an approved mentor-protege agreement, then SBA cannot find affiliation for the mentor providing that item of assistance. Let's go back to the bonding as an example. That's why we sometimes put bonding assistance in a mentor-protege agreement to say, well, okay, the protege needs help developing its bonding or increasing its bonding capacity, and the mentor is going to provide that assistance, maybe through guarantees or financial incentive, whatever the case may be. We put that in a mentor-protege agreement. That means that if the mentor helps the protege with bonding, SBA can't use that as the basis for finding affiliation between the two. So that's a real practical, kind of cogent example of the items of assistance that might be provided under that agreement. Now, a mentor and protege can also enter into a joint venture with each other. We were talking about small business joint ventures, and the general rule under SBA's regulations is that to qualify as a small business joint venture, you have to meet really two requirements. And the first requirement is a size requirement. And to meet that, either both ventures have to be small businesses, or they have to have a compliant mentor-protege agreement, an approved mentor-protege agreement between them. And then the second requirement would be that they have the compliant joint venture agreement. But because a mentor and protege are able to form a small business joint venture, and really if they do, only the protege size is going to matter at that point. That means that a small business protege can work with its large business mentor, its very experienced mentor, under a small business joint venture. And so really that's where we're seeing a lot of this benefit happen, or really a lot of the competitive landscape shift to mentor-protege joint ventures, because there you're getting the backing essentially of a large business and all of their capabilities and experiences that go with it, but you're bidding on small business work.
Now, does that fall under it can be approved without going through SBA?
No, so the mentor-protege agreement has to be approved by SBA.
All right, there you go. So the joint venture can do it without SBA, but the mentor-protege has to be approved by SBA.
Yes, that's correct. So you would have to be party to an approved mentor-protege agreement. So go through and get the mentor-protege agreement in place while SBA is taking a look at that. By the way, they tell folks it's 105 days approval process for the mentor-protege agreement. In my experience, it generally takes less than that, but of course it depends on the sufficiency of the agreement and really how busy SBA is at that point as well. But I say while that mentor-protege agreement is pending before SBA, then folks should work on their joint venture, getting the joint venture entity set up, getting it registered in SAM, getting its bank account set up, getting the joint venture agreement in place, all of that type of fun stuff. So that way, when the mentor-protege agreement is approved, you've got the joint venture set up, you're ready to submit your bid.
All right, that's good to know. All those are great questions. Talk about the 3 and 2 rule.
3 and 2 rule, that's another affiliation rule that existed specifically for joint ventures. So a joint venture is a limited duration entity under SBA's regulations. Essentially, they don't want you to have a perpetually existent joint venture. And so what the old rule said was that a joint venture could not be awarded more than 3 contracts over measured from 2 years from the date of its first award. So February 19th, 2024 is today. Eric, you and I have a joint venture. Under that old rule, the old 3 and 2 rule, if we were awarded a contract today, February 19th, 2024, our joint venture could continue bidding on new contracts, but we couldn't win more than 3 contracts during that 2-year period to February 19th, 2026.
Okay.
That rule was very goofy and, quite frankly, hard for a lot of small businesses to comply with. So SBA changed it, and they got rid of the 3-in portion. So they got rid of the cap on the number of awards. And now it's just a 2-year duration. So February 19th, 2024, our joint venture wins the award. That's our first award. We can keep bidding on as many new contracts as we want until February 19th, 2026. And at that point, we can no longer bid on any new contracts. We can still perform contracts that we were awarded prior to that date. We can still be awarded contracts that we bid prior to that date. We just can't bid on anything new after that 2 years from the date of our first award as a joint venture. But the regulations give a way around it, which is pretty unique in regulations. But they say we could just form a new joint venture. So we could form joint venture number 2. And joint venture number 2 could then start bidding on new contract awards at that point, and essentially that clock would be reset. So it's a changed rule. It's still very important and one you have to comply with, but I would put it under the traps for the unwary portion because the regulations kind of give the way around or tell you how to get around compliance with it.
Okay. Yeah, no, listen, I think that's been very helpful. You explained a lot of the process. I think that's a good refresher. What do they call that rule now? Because before it was called 3 and 2. So what do they call it now?
I think it's just the 2-year rule or something. I haven't seen it dubbed anything.
Okay, gotcha.
Maybe it's just the N2 rule. Take the 3 out.
All right, N2 rule. Yeah, because I'm like, what is it called now? What's the name for it? No, that's good. I mean, I like this because I can see where there's definitely some benefits of expediting the process for the joint ventures. I can see the benefits of removing the cap on the number of contracts. That's great. So it seems like they're up there working on some things. Oh, I know what we forgot to talk about. What about the new limits for sole source contracts?
Hopefully they're coming soon.
Okay.
So for the 8A program, it's what, 25 million for civilian entities and 100 million for DoD. I think is the entity owned 8A sole source limit. And for individually owned 8As, the limitation I think is 7.5 million for construction and 4.5 million for everything else, if I recall that correctly off the top of my head. But there is talk about increasing those sole source limits. That's going to have to be something that happens legislatively. And I believe that there was I think it was the last Congress, there was kind of bipartisan support for increasing those entity-owned sole source caps. But Congress being Congress, even though it was well supported, it just kind of died on the vine. But I think there's some optimism that will be reintroduced and will actually carry the day. So hopefully we will see those individually owned 8A thresholds increase.
Someone sent me some language recently about them changing the possibility of the individually owned to take advantage of the entity owned contract.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'd heard it. I mean,
I mean, again, they're proposing. I don't think it's nothing that's taken place, right?
Right. So it's certainly something that the sole source, the increased sole source thresholds for those entity-owned 8A companies. And by entity-owned, we mean companies that are owned by tribal organizations or Alaska Native corporations or Native Hawaiian organizations. Those type of entity-owned 8A companies. It's a tremendous competitive advantage for them, absolutely, because DoD is able to give sole source contracts at $100 million to those companies, and that's really unique in the contracting realm. I know the individual 8A companies have certainly been lobbying for a change for their sole source thresholds to increase. I don't know all of the political dynamics on the Hill and all of that. But I'm sure that it's something that there's a lot of discussion back and forth on between interested camps. But I'm hopeful that we will see sole source thresholds increase. By the way, I'm hopeful we'll see sole source thresholds increase not only for 8A companies but for all small businesses. So that I think particularly as we're seeing these opportunities get more and more competitive, larger and larger vehicles, it being harder for small businesses to earn contracts even at the small business level, I think increasing sole source kind of government wide across the small business spectrum would make some sense.
And there's the dog.
And there's the dog.
Interesting. I was funny when you're talking about the JV Mentor-Protégé program. I know, and I learned this about Travis, that he actually took advantage of that with Northrop Grumman. That's how he scaled his business. Yeah.
Right.
He had a mentor-protégé with Northrop Grumman.
Yeah. I mean, if you can find the right mentor for you, I think, really the mentor-protégé program is tremendous. And by the way, when we say the mentor-protégé program, we mean SBA's mentor-protégé program.
Yes.
But of course, DoD has a mentor-protégé program that's really DoD specific, and other agencies have them as well, even though they were supposed to kind of phase them out with SBA's program coming up. But SBA really is the government-wide program, and so that's the one that most of the time we talk about. And I think, if you can find a mentor that's committed to helping you grow and to providing the assistance that they say they're going to provide, it's a tremendous program. Where I see some folks struggle on both sides, quite frankly, as a mentor and as a protege, is if they kind of go in it tunnel vision thinking we're going to win this contract. And then either they don't win the contract and they're left saying, okay, now what? This thing that we were all on board for didn't happen. So now we're not really committed to this. Or sometimes even worst case is they actually win the contract and then they've got to figure out how to work together. And so that can be hard for businesses too. So, with the marriage analogy in hand, I think it's worth dating before you enter into a mentor-protege joint venture. Consider a prime sub team with your possible mentor or joint venture partner, just to make sure that you can work together, because you don't want to win that joint venture contract and then find out you're oil and water.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if you had asked me that question earlier, that's what would have been my response.
Yeah.
Date first.
Date first.
Date first. It's just really hard. All this stuff is already, getting the work accomplished. I think we don't spend enough time talking about that. And so people are like, yeah, get the contract. But really, that's just like the very beginning, right? When it starts. That's when you should be most afraid, is after you win. So,
yeah. I mean, it's the, okay, now what?
Now what? Right.
Yeah. It's transition day one.
Sure.
Let's get started. And I think for a lot of folks, you're absolutely right. That can be pretty daunting. I've been on the phone with some folks before that, called me one day and were so excited because they just won their largest contract. And they were so happy and they were elated, and I was happy for them. And then, a few weeks later, you get another call from them and they say, hey, we think we bit off more than we can chew. And you just don't want to be in that position.
Right. Yeah. Any other updates you want to share with us?
Everything's kind of always changing. We do a pretty decent job, I think, staying on top of things and covering them on Govcon Brief. So, I would encourage folks, if they haven't yet, take a look at Govcon Brief. But, as things kind of get heated up in 2024, we're going to see a few big things, I think, come out. There's going to be some developments for SBA size standards that we'll see kind of come out. Maybe not this year, but certainly I think next year we might see some stuff happen. But, always trying to stay on top of it all.
No, and I think that's important because, well, one, I have two goals here. One is, to your point, right? You want to stay on top of it. I feel like people, and again, I guess having been in this space for long enough, I just tend to make lawyers my friends. I feel like people just are so afraid of all these rules and regulations, and so they're like, throw up their hands up, as opposed to like, okay, why not just talk to people who are dealing with this in and out every day, right? Such as yourself. And that to me alleviates all, my worry, my concern, because I'm like, hey, I got someone I could call and talk to that I could trust to help me deal with the situation as it arrives. And also, before I get myself into that situation, I want to say that, because it's much easier to call before you get into the situation than to call and say, hey, Matt, I really messed up. Can you help me out here? And so he's got to try to untangle your doings. So I always I encourage people to reach out beforehand. It's a lot
Oh,
cheaper.
absolutely. You know, an ounce of what do they say? You know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
There you go.
It's,
That's
it's the
right.
same as in law as it is in medicine, where you know usually things are easier and less expensive to do at the outset. Now, I will say the great thing about the GovCon community, and Eric, you know, you and I know a lot of the same people. We swim in a lot of the same pools. Is there are great attorneys that are out there that you know I work with personally, even though they're not at the same firm, but I'll, you know, I'll tell my clients, I'll say, hey, if it's this type of issue, you need to
Right.
reach out to this person and let me make an introduction because they're really the best of the best,
Yes.
and I trust their advice. And I think really uniquely in government contracting, particularly in the small business world, that's really what a lot of us are aiming to do is to make sure that our clients get it right. And yes, there are, you know, there are times that we'll be adverse to somebody, you know, in a bid protest or in a size protest or something like that. But even in those cases, you know, it's still something where I can say, okay, now we've talked about that issue. Now let's talk about this other issue. And that's, I think, really the benefit to small business government contractors.
I would agree. I would agree with you. I've found that. And you've done that for me as well. You've recommended some people for me for some things that we've had. You said, hey, reach out to this guy in person. So I would agree. I would concur with that. I found that to be the case. Everyone is everyone seems to you know, like you said, dialogue. And so it's not I haven't found it to be like a closed system. So
No, not
which
at all.
that's for me, that's a breath of fresh air because again, like I said, as someone coming into this industry who I consider myself fairly new for like the people knowing me. I mean, I've been doing it for a while, but no one knew of me. I felt I've been well received. So you know, I thank all the attorneys for that.
Absolutely. Well, happy to be with you.
But listen, thank you, sir. I appreciate you. Appreciate the time today on
Thank
this
you.
holiday day. And, you know, we will have all your information available. Anything else that you want to submit that you haven't submitted to us to make sure we include with this when we release it. All right.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much again for having me.
Hey, always a pleasure. Thank you, sir. I'll see you.
Thank you. Take
Be
care.
good. Bye.